Okay, lesson 13, the last lesson in this unit. Our essential question asks, how do I find and use the basic ratio in proportion problems? That means we're only going to be talking about basic ratio for a lot of this lesson. If you look at numbers 1 and 2 on workbook page 33, it says these proportions use a basic ratio. There's actually a couple ways you can go about solving it. First, you could use a factor puzzle. You're probably very familiar with this. Our first ratio is 2 to 3, and that's definitely our basic ratio because I know I can't simplify that any further. Our second ratio is 10 to A. I'm not going to put A in there, I'm just going to leave the empty box. Then when I go ahead and solve this, let's see, 2 and 10 have 2 in common, and 2 and 3 only have 1 in common. 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times 5 is 10, and 3 times 5 is 15. That means A equals 15. And again, notice the answer is not 15, it's A equals 15. Always label your variable. So that's one strategy, using a factor puzzle. However, you have another option if you know the basic ratio. Please keep in mind that you can only use this if you know the basic ratio. You could use what we call a T-chart. Obviously, it's a T-chart because, it looks like a lowercase t. And your basic ratio should go at the top, just like the setup of a ratio table, right? We always put the basic ratio at the top. We usually had them in circles. Well, that's what we have here. We have the basic ratio at the top. Then we can write underneath our other ratio, 10 to, A, our missing number. And since you have the basic ratio, you can use, multiplication or division to break this down. 2 times what number gives you 10? Obviously 5. You can do the same thing on the other side. 3 times 5? Well, there's your 15. So this is only going to work if you have the basic ratio. If you do not have the basic ratio, you can't really use the T-chart option. Let's try this in number 2. First option, set up a factor puzzle like you're familiar with. B to 7, I'm not going to write B in there, I'm going to leave the empty space there. And 20 to 28. Now I'm assuming this is probably my basic ratio here, B to 7, except I'm missing half of it, but I could probably still figure it out. So let's see, 7 and 28, they have, 7 in common. 7 times 4 is 28, 5 times 4 is 20, 7 times 1 is 7, and 5 times 1 is 5. So B must be equal to 5. Now the other option, again, is using the T-chart because you know that you have a basic ratio. So here's our T-chart. We're missing the first part of our basic ratio, but we do know the second part. And then we have a 20 to 28. So you can think to yourself, 7 times what number gives you 28? Well, that's 4. Apply that same idea on this side. What number times 4 gives you 20? Obviously, it's 5. So you can see how the T-chart works when you have the basic ratio, even if half the basic ratio is missing. Now if you look at number 3, number 3 is a little bit different because it says what is the basic ratio for 21 to 35. So this time they're giving you a ratio, but they want you to figure out the basic ratio. Well, before we do number 3, look ahead to number 4. Discuss Sam's and Asha's strategies for finding the basic ratio for 24 to 36. So, in this case, we're talking about a completely different ratio, 24 to 36. Now, Sam's strategy was to use division. And it says, I put 24 to 36 in a ratio table. So imagine this as being a ratio table. And he divided both numbers by 6. So first he did 36 divided by 6. Then he did 24 divided by 6, and now he's left with 4 to 6. But then he kept going, because he knew 4 to 6 wasn't the basic ratio. So then he divided both sides by 2. 6 divided by 2 and 4 divided by 2. And that gave him 2 to 3. So the basic ratio is 2 to 3. and he used division to get there. It took him a couple steps, but he was able to get there. Asha, on the other hand, kind of set up a t-chart, even though she didn't have the basic ratio. So instead, let's imagine, this 2 and this 3 aren't really here. And she knew, okay, 24 is 2 times 12, and 36 is 3 times 12. So 12 is the common factor. So you can see that she drew the arrows. She knew that we were multiplying by 12. And she had to think to herself, what number times 12 gives me 36? Obviously, that's 3. What number times 12 gives me 2? Obviously, that's 2. So she thought about the 12's row of the multiplication table and knew the basic ratio had to be 2 to 3. So both Sam and Asha got the same answer. The basic ratio is 2 to 3. They just went about it a little bit differently. Now, back to number 3. We're going to figure out the basic ratio for 21 to 35. Probably the simplest way to do it involves division, but it also involves using the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor of two whole numbers is the greatest whole number that divides into both numbers without any remainder. So this should sound familiar to you, right? Just like making a list of all the factors and circling the ones they have in common, you can find the greatest common factor. So let's take a look at 21 to 35. I could start with 21 to 35 and then divide by my GCF. Well, the GCF here would probably be, I'm thinking, 7. 21 divided by 7 is 3. 35 divided by 7 is 5. So the basic ratio is 3 to 5. It's that simple. The fastest way to find a basic ratio is to use the greatest common factor. But you can also find the basic ratio by using 2 or more steps, just like Sam. Remember, he divided by 6 and then he divided by 2. Sometimes if you can't figure out the greatest common factor, you can still use other common factors and divide. Alright, takeaways. First, your greatest common factor, your GCF. That is when you have the greatest factor that 2 or more numbers can share. So you can take a look at the example there. 15 is the greatest common factor of 30 and 45, and you can see the lists of all the factors and how 15 is the greatest. There's other common factors like 1 and 3 and 5, but 15 is the greatest. When you have the basic ratio, you do not need to set up a factor puzzle. You can, but you can use multiplication in a T-chart to solve the proportion problems as well. So that's an option, but only if you have the basic ratio. And last, to find the basic ratio, you can use division in kind of a T-chart setup, however you want to do it. But division's probably the best way, and using the greatest common factor will get you there the fastest.